My name is Jason Morales. I am 34 years old. This happened in the autumn of 2023 when my friends and I decided to celebrate Maya's 29th birthday with a photography expedition into Redwood National Park. I'd always been the cautious, pragmatic one among our trio, the de facto leader, and while I dismissed ghost stories as superstition, I couldn't help but feel an inexplicable foreboding as we set off in our old, rattling RV. The plan had been simple enough. A week of capturing the majestic beauty of the ancient redwoods. A chance to escape the mundane and connect with nature. Maya, whose fascination with indigenous lore and spiritual traditions bordered on the mystical, insisted that our destination, the secluded groves deep within the park, was steeped in local legends. Greg Lawson, our ever-sarcastic friend and relentless skeptic, mocked such superstitions, his laughter echoing in the cramped RV as we drove along winding forest roads. From the start, trouble seemed to follow us. The RV, already a relic of better days, sputtered and groaned as if protesting the long journey ahead. Its electrical system flickered unpredictably, leaving us with unreliable lighting and a constant sense that even our mechanical protector might abandon us at the worst possible moment. By the time we reached a clearing near the edge of an ancient redwood forest, our excitement was tinged with a nervous apprehension. We set up camp under the sprawling canopy of centuries-old trees. As dusk crept in, Maya led us in a quiet exploration of the area. It was then, in the half-light, that I noticed something odd. Delicate carvings on the bark of one particularly massive redwood. They were intricate, indigenous symbols, etched deeply into the wood as if to warn or memorialize something long forgotten. Maya's eyes widened in recognition, and she murmured that they resembled markings she'd read about in local lore, tied to a spirit known as the weeping maiden of the redwoods. I scoffed inwardly at the idea of ghosts haunting the forest, but a cold shiver ran down my spine. That night, as darkness swallowed our campsite, the first unnerving signs began to manifest. I was sitting by the dwindling fire, lost in thought in the steady crackle of burning wood, when I first heard it. A soft, mournful whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't the typical rustling of leaves. It was as if a sorrowful voice was calling out, pleading to be heard. I glanced around, my heart pounding, but saw nothing but the dancing shadows of the redwoods. I tried to dismiss it as the wind playing tricks on my mind, yet deep down, I felt that something was watching us. Maya, ever intuitive, insisted we stay alert. "There's an energy here," she said quietly, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "A presence that demands respect." Greg, lounging in his fold-out chair with a half-smirk, retorted, "You mean a ghost? You're letting your imagination run wild, Maya." His laughter, though forced, did little to dispel the growing tension in the air. In the following hours, the atmosphere around our camp grew increasingly oppressive. The temperature plummeted, and the once comforting sound of the wind now carried eerie, disembodied murmurs. I found myself scanning the darkness, every rustle of leaves triggering a jolt of alarm. Then, as if in response to my growing anxiety, I saw movement at the edge of the light. A shadow flitting between the trees, too deliberate to be the erratic scuttle of a small animal. I woke Greg in a mild panic, and he joined me at the fire, though his eyes betrayed a hint of fear behind his sardonic mask. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He grumbled something dismissive, but his gaze was fixed on the darkness, as if he too recognized that something was off. Despite our mounting unease, we resolved to press on with our plans the next morning. However, the RV proved to be even less cooperative than we'd feared. In the early hours before dawn, as I attempted to check our equipment, a camera that had already malfunctioned once, and flashlights that dimmed inexplicably, The RV's engine sputtered and died entirely. We were stranded in the heart of the forest, with unreliable technology and a mounting sense that we'd intruded on something we didn't understand. By noon, a heavy fog had rolled in, blanketing the forest in an ethereal haze. It was during this fog that Maya discovered more unsettling evidence. While gathering firewood, she stumbled upon fresh markings etched into the bark of a smaller tree. A series of symbols that matched those on the ancient redwood but were newer, crudely carved. They looked like warnings, as if someone or something had been trying to communicate a message. Leave this place. That evening, as twilight bled into night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. This time, they weren't just carried by the wind, they seemed to emanate from all around us. I tried to rationalize it as the wind again, but the voices held a human quality, a sorrowful, aching lament that resonated deep within my bones. Maya's face grew pale. "I think the spirit of the weeping maiden is near," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the murmurs. "She's angered, saddened, or maybe both." I felt my skepticism waver as a sudden, inexplicable force battered our RV. Rocks and debris were hurled against the metal walls with a ferocity that defied explanation. In the chaos, Greg, who had been mocking the idea of ghosts just hours before, cried out in pain as a violent pressure struck him, leaving him writhing on the ground with a deep gash across his side. I rushed to his side, adrenaline surging through me. "Greg, hold on!" I shouted, my voice cracking with both fear and determination. His eyes were wide with shock and pain, and in that moment, the veneer of his usual sarcasm crumbled away to reveal raw terror. Maya knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she dabbed at his wound with a cloth. "This is punishment," she whispered, almost reverently, "for our disrespect." Desperation set in as the supernatural forces intensified. The forest itself seemed to come alive with malevolent intent. Shadows twisted and danced beyond the circle of our failing campfire, and the mournful cries of the unseen entity grew louder, echoing through the trees. I felt as if invisible hands were trying to push us out, as if the forest was reclaiming what it believed was rightfully its own. In our frantic attempts to restore some semblance of order, Maya proposed a ritual of appeasement. Drawing on her extensive knowledge of local indigenous traditions, she gathered items from the surroundings, a fallen branch, smooth stones, and some wildflowers, and arranged them in a small circle near the base of an ancient redwood. Her soft chants, barely audible over the cacophony of the forest's wrath, were an earnest plea for forgiveness and understanding. I reluctantly joined her, though every instinct screamed to flee. Greg, pale and shaken, hesitated before finally acquiescing. "I don't believe in this stuff," he mumbled, his voice cracking, "but I don't have much of a choice now." The ritual, performed in the dim glow of our failing fire, felt both desperate and surreal. As Maya's incantations filled the air, the forest seemed to momentarily still, as if listening. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, I thought we might have succeeded in calming the enraged spirit. But then the stillness shattered. The air erupted into a violent storm of energy, and the ground trembled beneath our feet. The spirit, now unmistakably present, materialized before us. A sorrowful, spectral figure of a woman whose eyes were brimming with grief and rage. Her long, flowing hair billowed as if underwater, and her translucent form flickered like candlelight in a draught. The weeping maiden of the redwoods stood before us, a tragic embodiment of ancient injustice and sorrow. Her mournful wails filled the air, transforming into a roar of fury as she advanced. I could see in her eyes not just grief, but a burning, unyielding anger. It was as though every act of disrespect, every intrusion upon this sacred land, had culminated in this moment of vengeful retribution. In her silent command, the forest bent to her will. Branches clawed at our RV, and the very ground threatened to swallow us whole. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed Greg's hand, urging him to move with me. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, my voice barely carrying over the roar of the wind and spirit. Maya continued her chanting, desperately pleading for mercy, but it was clear that the spirit's wrath could not be so easily abated. The struggle to escape was frantic. The RV, already weakened by mechanical failure, now buckled under the onslaught of supernatural force. Maya and I managed to haul Greg, who was bleeding badly and in shock, toward the vehicle. Every step was a battle against the unseen force that sought to hold us back. The forest seemed to come alive with malevolent intent, branches lashing out and roots twisting to trip us. I felt the weight of centuries pressing in, as if the very soul of the redwoods were determined to claim us. In the chaos, the spirit's sorrowful gaze locked onto Greg one final time before a powerful gust of wind snatched him from our grasp. I watched in horror as he was swallowed by the fog and darkness, his anguished scream fading into the relentless howling of the wind. My heart broke as I realized that his fate was now uncertain. Was he taken by the vengeful spirit, or had the forest claimed him forever? Maya's face was streaked with tears, her voice raw with despair. "I'm so sorry," she whispered over and over, as if apologizing to the forest itself. "We shouldn't have come here. We shouldn't have disrespected this sacred ground." I had no words to comfort her, only the gnawing realization that our intrusion had awakened something ancient and unforgiving. In a final surge of desperate energy, I managed to force the RV into motion. The engine, as if summoning every last spark of life, roared back to life. We barreled down the forest road, the spectral cries of the weeping maiden echoing behind us. The fog swallowed the trees, and I could only pray that we were leaving behind the nightmare that had unfolded. Hours later, battered and exhausted, we were found by a local park ranger. His weathered face and calm demeanor contrasted sharply with our disheveled state. He listened silently as I recounted our ordeal, the strange carvings, the chilling whispers, the violent supernatural force, and Greg's horrifying fate. The ranger nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a sorrowful understanding. "That," he said in a measured tone, "is the work of the weeping maiden. A spirit born of deep historical injustice. Long ago, this land was sacred to the indigenous people, and when it was desecrated, the spirit of a wronged woman vowed to protect it at all costs." He paused, letting his words sink in. Modern intruders, with their careless disregard for these traditions, awaken a wrath that can be both tragic and deadly. I sat there, the ranger's words echoing in my mind as I tried to reconcile the rational part of me with the undeniable reality of what we had experienced. Maya was quiet, her eyes haunted by the memory of the spirit's sorrowful rage. And as for Greg, if he was still alive at all, I wasn't sure I could ever forgive myself for not having protected him better. The remainder of our journey was a blur of sorrow and regret. We left Redwood National Park with our lives intact, but our hearts and minds were forever scarred by that night. Every time I catch a glimpse of the redwoods swaying in the wind, or hear the whisper of the wind through the trees, I am transported back to that fateful evening. The desperate ritual, the vengeful spirit, and the agonizing loss of a friend. Now, whenever I return to the edges of nature, I do so with a deep, abiding respect for the sacred places and the ancient forces that dwell there. I have learned that nature holds secrets and memories that no modern technology or human hubris can ever fully comprehend. The redwoods remain silent sentinels to the past, and I know that somewhere within their ancient boughs, the weeping maiden still watches, mourning the wrongs of history and guarding her sacred domain with a sorrow that can ignite into violence at any time. In the quiet moments that follow a long, uneasy night, I sometimes wonder if we ever truly escaped her wrath, or if she continues to haunt the edges of our lives, a constant reminder that some spirits are not so easily appeased. And as I tell this story, I can't help but feel that every rustle of the leaves and every sigh of the wind might carry her voice, an eternal, mournful lament echoing among the redwoods, urging all who enter to remember and respect the ancient, sacred forces of this land. My name is Max Davis. I am 41 years old. This happened in the summer of 2023, when I decided to retreat into the vast, unforgiving expanse of Death Valley National Park. I'd been running from my past, a past marked by loss and regret, and I hoped that the barren desert might offer the solitude and clarity I so desperately needed. I climbed into my modest, well-worn RV, a relic that had seen better days, and set off for Mesquite Spring, where the desert stretched endlessly beneath a blistering sun by day and turned into a realm of frigid, echoing silence by night. The first few days were uneventful. I drove along long, winding roads with little more than the hum of the engine and the constant digital chatter of a failing GPS for company. The RV's radio crackled intermittently with static, and even my phone, my lifeline to the modern world, would lose signal amid the harsh terrain. I accepted these inconveniences as part of the experience, a necessary isolation that allowed me to face the memories I had been running from. Yet, as I parked on a remote patch of desert and began setting up camp, an unsettling feeling began to seep into my bones. I had chosen a campsite near a series of weathered rock formations that jutted out of the sand like the bones of some ancient creature. The rocks bore strange, cryptic symbols etched deeply into their surfaces. They weren't just random scratches made by the wind, they seemed deliberate, ritualistic almost, a language of a people long gone. I knelt down to examine them, running my fingertips over the worn carvings. The markings reminded me vaguely of the indigenous lore I had read about in old, dusty books, a legend of a malevolent force known as the sand devourer, an entity said to be born of the harsh desert itself, taking form in the shifting sands and manifesting its wrath on those who dared trespass on its sacred ground. I dismissed the thought with a shake of my head. Superstitions, I told myself. I was a pragmatic man, a former military guy used to facing real dangers. Yet, as twilight began to bleed across the horizon, the desert's surface took on a surreal quality. The scorching heat of the day evaporated, replaced by a bone-chilling cold that pricked at my skin. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me. That first night, as darkness enveloped the landscape, I sat by a small, carefully kindled fire outside the RV. The desert, usually mute, was now alive with a chorus of whispering winds. At first, I believed it to be nothing more than the natural murmur of the sand shifting in the cool air, but soon I began to discern a rhythmic pattern in the sound, a low, almost musical chanting that seemed to rise and fall with the gusts. I strained my ears, trying to isolate the noise from the rustling of the mesquite and the distant call of a coyote. The voice was not human, yet it carried an eerie familiarity, as if it were echoing some ancient sorrow. Sleep was elusive that night. I lay awake, staring through the small window at the inky sky sprinkled with stars, feeling as though unseen eyes were watching my every move. In the distance, I saw the faint outline of a figure moving with deliberate purpose, a silhouette that merged with the undulating dunes. I convinced myself it was a trick of my fatigued mind. but a prickle of dread refused to leave my skin. The following day, I set out to explore the area around my campsite. The desert revealed more signs of its hidden presence. Footprints in the sand that were too deep and precise to belong to any common animal, and more of those ancient symbols carved into rocks that I hadn't noticed before. Each discovery added another layer to my growing unease. The extreme solitude of the desert, already a mirror for my inner desolation, now seemed to be an active, malevolent force. As dusk began to fall again, I heard the chanting once more, louder and closer this time. The sound seemed to emanate from all around me, as if the very air was filled with the voices of unseen worshippers. The chill in the air deepened, and the once familiar landscape took on an alien, almost sinister aspect. I could see shadows dancing at the periphery of my vision, figures that vanished when I turned my head. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat echoing the rising terror that something was horribly wrong. I tried to start the RV's engine to retreat back to civilization, but it sputtered and refused to come to life. My phone showed no signal, and the radio was silent save for the persistent static and those unearthly whispers. I was stranded, isolated in an environment that now felt decidedly hostile. That night, the desert unleashed its fury. A violent sandstorm began to brew suddenly, the sky darkening as if an omen had been unfurled. I secured what little I could inside the RV, hoping to ride out the tempest, when I heard a distant sound, a human-like chanting that mingled with the howling wind. Gathering the courage to step outside, I found myself drawn toward the source. Through the swirling sands, I made out the vague forms of people, their silhouettes illuminated intermittently by flashes of lightning in the distance. They were moving in a deliberate, almost ritualistic formation, their voices rising and falling in a hypnotic cadence. I followed them at a safe distance, curiosity battling with fear. The group was led by a tall, hooded figure whose presence exuded an unsettling calm. The hood obscured his features, but his eyes, glinting unnaturally in the intermittent light, seemed to hold an ancient, unyielding resolve. The cultists gathered around an ancient, weather-beaten monolith adorned with the same cryptic symbols I had seen earlier. They were deep in their ritual, their chants reaching a fevered pitch as they offered up whispered invocations to an unseen deity. I hid behind a large boulder, my breath shallow and rapid. I could feel the charged energy in the air, as if the desert itself was pulsating with a life force that was both ancient and malevolent. My mind raced with the legends of the sand devourer, a demon-like spirit of the desert, a force of nature that devoured all who disrespected its domain. The cultists' ritual seemed to be an offering, a way to appease or summon this terrifying entity. As the sandstorm intensified, the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural began to blur. The cultists' chanting grew louder, melding with the roar of the wind. In the chaos of the swirling sand, I caught glimpses of something moving among the figures, a dark, shifting presence that did not belong to any of them. It was as if the storm had birthed an avatar of terror itself. My skin crawled as I realized that the legend was no mere myth. The sand devourer was real, and it was here, lurking in the storm. In that moment, I understood that I had a choice: to remain hidden and hope the entity passed me by, or to confront the darkness and try to escape the desert's clutches. The inner turmoil that had haunted me, my grief, my regrets, suddenly seemed trivial compared to the immediate threat of this ancient, vengeful force. The whispers, the shifting sands, the cryptic symbols, they all converged into a single, terrifying realization. The desert was alive with anger, and I was its unwitting target. I made my way back to the RV, determined to salvage what I could and leave the cursed area. Every step was a struggle against the biting wind and the unyielding pull of the sand. I could still hear the cultists' chants in the distance. And now there was an undercurrent of something darker, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated beneath the very ground. The hooded figure's words echoed in my mind, though I hadn't heard them clearly. A demand for sacrifice, a plea to feed the ancient hunger of the desert. By the time I reached the RV, the sandstorm had reached a furious crescendo. The vehicle shuddered under the force of the winds, its battered frame groaning in protest. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling, and finally managed to start the engine. With the storm howling around me and the oppressive presence of the sand devourer bearing down, I drove blindly down a narrow, unlit desert road. The windshield wipers barely kept pace with the furious barrage of sand, and the world outside was reduced to a blur of orange and black. Every mile that passed felt like an eternity. The storm seemed endless, and every twist of the road brought a new wave of panic. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the vengeful spirit of the desert, or perhaps its earthly emissaries, were following my every move. The oppressive silence between the roars of the engine and the shrieks of the wind allowed my mind to spiral into dark, desperate thoughts. I recalled the legends, the warnings, and the ancient symbols I had seen. The sand devourer was not a mere myth. It was a force of nature, born of the relentless, brutal beauty of the desert and the sorrow of forgotten souls. After what felt like an eternity, the storm began to abate. I emerged from the haze of swirling sand to find myself on a stretch of road lined with scrubby vegetation and weathered rocks. My RV, battered but still operational, seemed almost miraculous against the vast, desolate backdrop. I slowed down, heart still pounding, and allowed myself a moment of respite. I tried to rationalize the night's events, attributing them to the stress of isolation and the desert's extreme conditions. But deep down, I knew that what I had encountered was beyond human understanding. As dawn broke, the oppressive darkness of the night gave way to a pale, eerie light. I pulled over near a small outcrop of rocks and climbed out of the RV. The storm had left the desert scarred, a chaotic tapestry of rippling sand and half-buried symbols that glowed faintly in the early light. I inspected the ancient carvings, now more numerous than before, their meanings as elusive as the shifting dunes. In that quiet moment, I felt both insignificant and profoundly exposed to the forces that had orchestrated the night's terror. I sat down on a large, sun-warmed rock and allowed myself to grieve, not just for the personal losses that had driven me into the desert, but for the loss of innocence and the unyielding cruelty of nature. The desert had shown me a glimpse of something primordial, a darkness that existed long before humans and would linger long after we were gone. I realized that I had been chosen, not in a benevolent sense, but as a sacrifice to the ancient, hungry spirit of this barren land. The memory of the hooded figure and the cultists haunted me as I resumed my journey. I drove slowly, each mile marked by an overwhelming sense of dread and the constant awareness that I was being watched by something unseen. The desert, with all its harsh beauty, had stripped me down to my bare essence, leaving me raw and vulnerable. Every gust of wind, every whisper in the sand, seemed like a reminder that the sand devourer was still out there, waiting for its next opportunity. I eventually reached the outskirts of a small desert town, where modernity and civilization offered a temporary reprieve from the ancient terrors of the wilderness. There, in a modest motel room, I attempted to piece together the shattered remnants of my sanity. I contacted a friend, a park ranger with extensive knowledge of local lore, hoping that he might offer some rational explanation for what I'd witnessed. He listened intently, his expression somber as I recounted the eerie symbols, the chanting in the storm, and the ominous presence that seemed to manifest from the very sand itself. He told me that the legends of the sand devourer were known among the local indigenous tribes, a spirit born from the relentless cruelty of the desert and the sorrow of lost lives. The cultists I had seen were not simply madmen. They were devotees who believed that by offering sacrifices to this ancient force, they could harness its power, or at least appease its wrath. His words, delivered in a calm and measured tone, did little to ease the terror that still gripped me. In fact, they only confirmed what I had long feared, that the desert was a living, malevolent force, indifferent to the suffering of those who dared trespass on its sacred ground. Over the next few weeks, I tried to return to normalcy, but the desert had left its mark on me. The haunting visions of shifting sands and ghostly cultists lingered in my dreams, and every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear that low, relentless chanting carried on the wind. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting the hooded figure to appear in the corner of my vision. The more I tried to dismiss it as a figment of my traumatized imagination, the more real it became. I eventually left the town and returned to my life, but the memory of that night in Death Valley never faded. I still own that battered RV, parked in my driveway as a grim reminder of the desert's power and the night I nearly lost myself to its endless void. Every so often, when a gust of wind stirs the leaves or the sand outside my window dances in the light, I can't help but feel that the sand devourer is watching, its presence as indelible as the ancient symbols carved into those weathered rocks. Now, I live with the constant, uneasy knowledge that some forces in this world are beyond our control, a dark undercurrent that flows through the land, waiting patiently for a moment of weakness. I've learned to respect the boundaries between man and nature, to acknowledge that the desert is not merely a backdrop for our lives, but a living testament to the mysteries of existence. And though I try to move on, I know that somewhere in the endless, shifting sands of Death Valley, the spirit of the sand devourer still lingers, an eternal reminder that the past never truly dies, and some terrors can never be left behind. My name is Caroline Rivera. I am 38 years old. This happened in the autumn of 2022, when I decided to escape the clamor of city life and the weight of my own memories by renting a vintage RV and heading into Plumas National Forest. I was desperate for solitude, a quiet retreat by a secluded mountain lake where I hoped to unlock the creative dam that had choked my writing for months. I was also haunted by a deep, unspoken guilt over a tragedy from my past, and I believed that isolation might force me to confront the darkness that had long lurked at the edge of my mind. The drive up to the forest was both a physical and emotional journey. The roads wound through a patchwork of golden aspen and towering pine, their reflections dancing on the glass of the RV as I drove past. The RV itself was a relic, a lovingly restored vehicle with more charm than modern convenience. Its electrical system was temperamental, and I knew that in such remote parts, modern communication would be unreliable at best. Yet, these shortcomings only added to the nostalgic allure of my escape. I arrived at a quiet clearing by a mountain lake, its still, glassy surface framed by rugged pines and distant peaks. The beauty of the scene was almost otherworldly, a mirror of nature's serenity. I set up camp, parking the RV on a small patch of cleared ground, and began to unpack my modest belongings. I found an old, abandoned ranger's cabin nearby, its weathered wood and peeling paint whispering stories of bygone days. Something about that cabin beckoned me, so I resolved to explore it later. The first evening was peaceful, yet as twilight deepened I noticed something peculiar. While sitting outside the RV with my journal in hand, I gazed at the lake's surface. At first, I was captivated by the perfect reflection of the darkening sky and the pines along the shore, but then I caught a glimpse of something odd, a slight delay between my movements and the reflection in the water. When I raised my hand to scribble a note, the hand in the reflection lagged behind for a moment longer than it should have. I blinked, certain it was just a trick of light or fatigue, but a chill crawled up my spine. The next day, after a breakfast of stale coffee and a hastily prepared sandwich, I decided to explore the surroundings. I wandered along a narrow trail that wound around the lake, marveling at the interplay of sunlight and shadow among the ancient pines. My thoughts drifted between memories and the story I had hoped to write, a psychological exploration of identity and guilt. Yet, the serenity of the forest began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like an isolating echo chamber of my own doubts. I returned to the RV in the afternoon, planning to review my notes, when I discovered an old mirror tucked away in a dusty corner of the abandoned ranger's cabin. Its frame was intricately carved with twisting motifs that reminded me of vines and branches, and the glass itself was slightly tarnished with age. I felt an inexplicable compulsion to clean it up and take it with me, as if it held some forgotten secret I was meant to uncover. That night, with the moon hidden behind a veil of clouds, I set the antique mirror on a small table in the RV. I sat before it for a long time, scrutinizing my reflection. At first, everything appeared normal, yet as I leaned closer, I noticed the eyes in the reflection were darker, almost hollow, and there was a subtle smirk playing at the corner of my lips, a smile that I was sure I did not form. I shook my head, chiding myself for being overly imaginative. The mirror was old and likely distorted, I reasoned, and my mind was prone to tricks in the silence of the night. But the next morning, the disturbances began anew. As I sipped my coffee by the window, I noticed in the condensation on the glass that my reflection did something I hadn't done. An almost imperceptible tilt of the head, as if acknowledging something behind me. When I spun around, there was nothing there. I found myself increasingly unsettled by these subtle discrepancies. The creeping sensation that my reflection was not quite my own, that it carried a secret malice lurking beneath the surface. Over the following days, I tried to immerse myself in work. I wrote in my journal, detailed my thoughts, and even began drafting passages for my novel. Yet, everywhere I looked, a puddle by the RV after a light rain, the glossy surface of the lake at dawn, or even the shiny metal of a car passing in the distance. I sensed a presence in my reflection that was not entirely aligned with my actions. Often, it was as if my doppelganger lagged behind, as if waiting, observing. One particularly dismal evening, I returned to the cabin after a long day of writing and wandering the forest. The wind had picked up, rustling the pines in a mournful cadence, and the sky was a deep slate gray. Inside the cabin, I lit a small lantern, its feeble glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. I found myself drawn once again to the antique mirror, now propped against a broken table. I could no longer ignore the sense that the mirror was more than a mere object. It was a portal to something dark within me. As I gazed into its reflective surface, the image began to shift. The reflection that stared back seemed to smile knowingly, its eyes glinting with an unsettling light. I felt as though it were trying to communicate, to force me to confront the guilt and remorse that had haunted me for years. I recalled the terrible decision I had made, the moment that had shattered my world and left me burdened with remorse. In the mirror's depth, I saw flashes of that memory, shattered glass, anguished faces, and a part of me that I had long tried to forget. Sleep came fitfully that night. In my dreams, I was pursued by a figure that looked like me, yet distorted. Its eyes empty, its smile predatory. It whispered my name over and over, a constant reminder of my failures, and the darkness I tried so hard to hide. I awoke in a cold sweat, the whispers echoing in my ears long after the dream had faded. The next morning, I ventured out to the lake, hoping that the natural beauty of the water would soothe my troubled mind. The surface of the lake was eerily still, and the early light painted everything in muted blues and grays. I knelt at the water's edge and peered into its depths. For a moment, I thought I saw my reflection smile, a slow, deliberate curl of the lips that was not mine. I recoiled, heart pounding, and staggered back to the shore. My mind raced with questions. Had I imagined it, or was the mirror's influence seeping into every reflective surface? Days passed in a disorienting blur of writing, wandering, and the persistent, nagging feeling of being watched by my own eyes. The lines between my inner thoughts and the external world began to blur. At times, I questioned whether the disturbances were the result of my own fractured psyche, or if something supernatural had invaded my reality. The isolation of the forest, combined with the ever-present mirror and the lake's uncanny reflections, slowly eroded my sense of stability. I became increasingly desperate to rid myself of this torment. I contemplated destroying the mirror, thinking that perhaps if I shattered it, I could break the hold it had over me. One stormy night, when the wind howled through the pines and the RV's windows rattled in their frames, I gathered my resolve. Lightning split the sky, and in a moment of furious clarity, I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the RV's small toolkit and marched back to the cabin. Under the flickering light of my lantern, I set the mirror on the floor. The room was silent except for the storm outside and the pounding of my heart. I raised the poker and brought it down with all the strength I could muster. The glass shattered with a sound that seemed to echo into eternity, sending shards skittering across the wooden floor. For a brief, breathless moment, I felt a surge of relief, as if a tangible part of the oppressive weight had been shattered along with the mirror. But as I knelt amidst the fragments, something changed. In the largest shard lying on the floor, I saw my reflection again. This time, it was unmistakable, a face contorted with anguish, and something else, something dark that I couldn't define. The image moved independently of me, a mocking grin playing on my lips. I stumbled back, dropping the shard, and it clattered against the wall. My breath caught in my throat as the shard's surface seemed to ripple, as if it were a window to another realm. The next few hours were a blur of terror and self-loathing. I tried to convince myself that I had merely seen a trick of the light, a residual hallucination from the stress of isolation. Yet, every reflective surface in the RV, the window, a discarded spoon, even a patch of shiny metal on the dashboard, now betrayed me. Each time, I glimpsed that malevolent smile, that glint of darkness in eyes that were once solely my own. I realized with mounting horror that the antique mirror had been more than just a relic. It had been a conduit for the manifestation of my inner demons. The doppelganger was not an external entity, but a reflection of the guilt, shame, and unresolved grief that had festered within me. It was as if my darker self had been given form, a spectral reminder that I could never outrun my past. In a final act of desperation, I decided to confront the lake one last time. On a moonless night, with only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant call of nocturnal creatures for company, I made my way down to the water's edge. The lake was a vast, inky expanse, its surface unnervingly smooth. I stood there, transfixed as I peered into its depths. At first, all I saw was darkness. Then, slowly, the water began to stir. Shapes emerged, at first vague and shifting, then increasingly distinct. I saw my face, not as I remembered it, but twisted in sorrow and malice. The reflection in the water smiled at me, a slow, deliberate curve of the lips that spoke of secrets and regrets. It beckoned me closer with silent, hypnotic allure. I felt a pull, as though the lake itself were drawing me in. The line between reality and the nightmare of my own mind blurred until I could no longer tell where I ended and the reflection began. In that moment, I understood that this confrontation was not merely with a spectral doppelganger, but with the very essence of my inner darkness. The figure in the water was everything I had tried to bury, the guilt of my past, the regret over decisions that could never be undone, and the haunting fear that I was irreparably broken. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared into those unyielding eyes. For what felt like an eternity, I wavered on the brink of surrender, of allowing that darkness to consume me, to merge with it and become one with the haunting reflection. Then, in a final desperate act of defiance, I forced myself to step back. I tore my gaze away from the lake and stumbled back toward the RV, each step a battle against the seductive pull of my own self-destruction. In the days that followed, I remained by the lake, unsettled yet determined. I continued to write, pouring my anguish and fear onto the pages of my journal, seeking to exorcise the ghost of my guilt through the catharsis of words. I left the shattered mirror behind in the cabin, a broken relic of a night when my inner demons had almost overtaken me. I could not say for sure whether I had vanquished that spectral doppelganger or merely exiled it to the shadows of my mind. But I knew one thing. The reflections in the pines and in the still waters of that lake would forever remind me of the fragile boundary between redemption and ruin. I eventually left Plumas National Forest with more questions than answers, a battered soul carrying the scars of that harrowing encounter. Sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a window or see a ripple in a puddle, I think I see that dark, mocking smile for just a moment longer than I should. And in those fleeting instants, I am reminded that the true horror was not some external monster, but the unrelenting force of my own inner demons. Now, as I sit at my desk in the relative safety of my apartment, I still wonder if I ever truly escaped the forest, or if the specter of my guilt remains with me, lurking behind every reflection. The line between who I was and who I might become is thinner than I ever imagined. I continue to write, not only to create but to understand, and perhaps, in some quiet corner of my soul, to atone. Even now, late at night, when the world is silent, I sometimes feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me. I remind myself that the darkness I once confronted in that lonely forest is a part of me, but it does not define me. I have chosen to face my reflections, however unsettling they may be, and in doing so, I strive to forge a path toward healing. Yet, every so often, when a shadow falls just a bit too long or a light flickers in the mirror, I cannot help but wonder if that other version of me is still watching, waiting for a moment of weakness, or perhaps simply to remind me that some truths, once seen, can never be fully erased. My name is Leo McKinney. I am 45 years old. This happened in the summer of 2021, when I set out in my aging RV for a journey into the rugged reaches of Lassen Volcanic National Park. I'd spent years chasing stories as a journalist and photographer, but the project that had drawn me here was deeply personal. A quest to document the abandoned mining towns scattered among the foothills, and more hauntingly, to confront the demons of my past. My father had died in a mining accident when I was young, and the guilt and sorrow I carried with me had long festered in silence. I believed that by visiting the remnants of the mines, perhaps I could finally understand, and maybe even forgive, the tragedies that had shaped my life. The drive into the wilderness was both a physical trial and an emotional odyssey. My RV, a battered relic that creaked with every mile, proved as temperamental as my own nerves. Its engine sputtered intermittently along the narrow, winding roads, and I couldn't shake the nagging thought that, in this remote corner of the world, help would be a distant memory if things went wrong. Still, the lure of forgotten stories, of secrets left to rot in the past, drove me onward. I arrived at a small clearing near the remains of an old mining town, its ruined buildings and rusted equipment partially swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. The centerpiece of the desolation was an abandoned mine, its entrance yawning open like a dark mouth. Nearby, the remnants of a furnace, once the heart of the mining operation, stood in eerie isolation. Faded inscriptions on the charred wall of the furnace warned, "Disturb not the shadow in the furnace." I couldn't help but feel that the words, as much as the silence of the place, were meant for me. The first evening was disconcertingly quiet. I set up my small campsite beside the ruins, parking the RV as close to the mine entrance as safety would allow. As twilight bled into darkness, I sat outside, reviewing the preliminary shots on my aging camera. The images were grainy and distorted, as if the equipment were struggling against the weight of the memories it captured. But it wasn't just the poor quality of the photos. There was something else. Faint, almost imperceptible shapes and figures lurking in the periphery of each frame. I dismissed them as technical glitches, artifacts of light and shadow in a place that had known too much suffering. Later that night, as I sat huddled inside the RV listening to the wind howl through the trees, I began to hear it. At first, it was nothing more than a low murmur, a whisper that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath me. Then, as the darkness deepened, the whisper grew into a chorus of forlorn voices, echoes of men long dead. They spoke in fragmented phrases, words that I couldn't decipher, but the tone was unmistakable. Grief, regret, and a burning, unfulfilled rage. I told myself it was the wind playing tricks on my mind, yet the hairs on my arms stood on end, and a cold dread seeped into my bones. The next morning, determined to find answers, I ventured toward the mine. The daylight did little to dispel the heavy atmosphere that clung to the ruined complex. I walked slowly along the mine's entrance, my boots crunching on broken glass and loose gravel. Every step I took seemed to echo with the ghosts of the past. Near the entrance I found remnants of old mining equipment, a rusted lantern, a battered helmet, and, most disturbingly, a faded photograph of a group of miners. One of the men in the picture bore an uncanny resemblance to me, with eyes that were all too familiar in their sorrowful intensity. A chill ran through me as I stared at the faded faces, as though the very air were charged with memories of loss. Inside the mine, darkness swallowed me whole. I fumbled with my flashlight, its beam weak and flickering as I navigated the narrow corridors. The walls were pockmarked with the scars of long-forgotten explosions, and the scent of damp earth and decay filled my nostrils. As I pressed deeper, I began to notice odd markings carved into the rock, symbols and initials that I could not decipher. They were jagged and raw, as if etched in desperation. In the deepest recesses of the tunnel, I discovered a small chamber, and there, against the far wall, was a charred journal. Its pages, half devoured by flame, contained frantic scribbles about a terrible accident, a cave-in that had claimed the lives of many miners, including, it seemed, my father. My heart pounded as I read the tattered words, each sentence a dagger twisting deeper into old wounds. The journal spoke of an ominous presence, a shadow that haunted the furnace area, blamed for the catastrophe. According to the entries, the entity had been born of the miners' collective anguish, a vengeful spirit that thrived on guilt and despair. They called it simply the shadow in the furnace. As I held the journal, the chill in the air grew more pronounced, and I could almost feel unseen eyes watching me from the darkness. That night, as I returned to the RV with the journal clutched in my trembling hands, the supernatural occurrences escalated. My equipment began to malfunction in inexplicable ways. A sudden burst of static on the radio, photographs that developed with ghostly overlays of a figure in the background, and the recurring sound of heavy footsteps echoing around the RV. I kept expecting to see something, a silhouette at the edge of the light, a figure watching me from the doorway, but every time I looked, there was nothing but the oppressive darkness. It wasn't long before I caught a glimpse of the entity itself. I was making repairs to the RV's engine when I saw it, a shape, half-formed and shifting like smoke, standing at the threshold of the mine entrance. It was the unmistakable outline of a miner, ragged clothing, a face obscured by a dusty, tattered hat, and eyes that glowed with a malevolent intensity. The figure did not move closer, yet its presence was undeniable. I froze, the wrench slipping from my grasp, as the shadow seemed to study me with an unnerving calm. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the darkness of the ruined mine, leaving me trembling and breathless. Over the next few days, the phenomenon only grew bolder. My RV, already plagued by mechanical issues, broke down completely one chilly morning, leaving me stranded near the ghost town. With no way to call for help and no prospect of immediate repair, I was forced to rely on my own 2 feet to scavenge for supplies. Everywhere I went, I felt the oppressive presence of the shadow. At dusk, the air would fill with the sound of clanging metal and distant, mournful voices, a symphony of sorrow that pulled me toward the mine as if it were a siren's call. I found myself drawn back into the tunnels time and again, compelled by a mix of terror and the desperate need for answers. Each foray into the darkness unearthed new horrors. Tools scattered in chaotic disarray, walls scorched by flames that had long since died out, and eerie etchings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. At one point, I discovered a cavern where the remnants of the furnace still glowed faintly with embers, casting a hellish light on a mural painted on the wall. A crude depiction of a miner clutching his chest, surrounded by shadowy figures. The image was accompanied by a single, repeated phrase scrawled in shaky handwriting: "Pay your dues." Late one night, driven by equal measures of dread and determination, I ventured deeper into the mine than I ever had before. I was armed only with a flashlight, my camera, and the burning need to confront the truth about the tragedy that had haunted my family for so long. The corridors twisted and turned, and the air grew heavy with the smell of sulfur and decay. As I descended into a narrow, claustrophobic passageway, I began to hear the whispers again, low, anguished voices that seemed to emanate from the very walls. They spoke of betrayal, of debts unpaid, of a fate sealed by guilt. Then, in the suffocating darkness of a long-forgotten tunnel, I encountered it. The shadow in the furnace materialized fully before me, a towering, spectral figure that radiated despair and anger. Its form was that of a miner, but distorted and monstrous. Elongated limbs, a face twisted into a grimace of eternal torment, and eyes that burned like coals in the dark. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, each step sending tremors through the ground. The entity's presence was overwhelming, as if it carried the collective agony of every soul lost in the mine. I stood frozen, paralyzed by fear and the weight of my own memories. The apparition spoke in a voice that resonated deep within my chest, a guttural, sorrowful sound that seemed to echo from another realm. It told me that the mine was cursed, that the sins of the past demanded to be remembered, and that my presence had stirred old wounds. The ghost's gaze locked onto mine, and in that moment, I saw flashes of my father's face, a man broken by grief, caught in the throes of a fatal accident, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and terror. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. This entity was not merely a random ghost, but a manifestation of all the guilt and sorrow that had been buried in the darkness of that tragic day. As the spectral miner advanced, I felt a profound, almost physical pain, a merging of my own internal anguish with the entity's relentless torment. My heart pounded in my ears, and I scrambled backwards along the slick, crumbling tunnel. The entity's presence grew more violent, and the walls around me seemed to close in as if the very mine were collapsing under the weight of its misery. I sprinted through the corridors, the sound of its slow, deliberate footsteps echoing in pursuit. At one point, a boulder tumbled down the passageway, and I narrowly avoided being crushed. In that moment, I knew I had to confront the darkness rather than run forever from it. Cornered in a claustrophobic chamber lit only by the flickering remnants of embers, I found myself face to face with the full force of the curse. The shadow in the furnace loomed over me, its eyes blazing with an intensity that threatened to burn away all pretense of rational thought. Trembling, I realized that the entity was forcing me to reckon with my past, to face the guilt of my father's death, the pain I had long tried to ignore, and the legacy of sorrow that had haunted our family. With no escape but to stand my ground, I allowed the memories to wash over me. The desperate cries for help in the mine, the final moments of chaos, and my own silent complicity in the aftermath of tragedy. In that raw, heart-wrenching moment of self-confrontation, I spoke aloud, my voice cracking with sorrow and regret. I apologized to my father, to the souls lost in the mine, to the cursed land that had borne witness to so much suffering. I acknowledged my own failures, the burden of guilt that had weighed me down for decades. Whether it was my words or the catharsis of finally admitting my deepest regrets, I felt a shift in the oppressive atmosphere. The shadow's form wavered, its furious eyes softening ever so slightly as if in reluctant acceptance. For an agonizing minute that stretched into eternity, the spectral figure and I were locked in a silent communion, a desperate exchange between a haunted man and the embodiment of his collective grief. Then, as if sated by my acknowledgement, the entity began to recede. Its form dissolved slowly into the darkness of the tunnel, leaving behind only the echo of its sorrowful voice and the heavy silence of the mine. I staggered out of the depths, my body bruised and spirit raw, but with a fragile sense of closure that I had never known before. The RV, long since abandoned by its mechanical whims, was waiting at the edge of the ruins, as if in a final farewell. I climbed back into its creaking interior, the weight of the past lingering in every breath. The journey out of that forsaken place was a blur of shattered reflections and muted whispers, a reminder that some tragedies never truly fade but can be acknowledged and, perhaps, forgiven. I eventually made it back to civilization, my camera filled with distorted images of ghostly apparitions and ruined corridors, my journal heavy with the confessions of a haunted soul. I never did finish that documentary, nor did I seek public acclaim for what I had experienced. Instead, I carried the memories with me, a bittersweet reminder that the past, no matter how painful, is an inseparable part of who we are. Now, as I sit in the quiet of my modest apartment, I often find myself staring into mirrors or gazing out of rain-streaked windows, wondering if the darkness of that cursed mine still lingers somewhere in the recesses of my mind. The images of the shadow in the furnace, its burning eyes and tormented form, flash in my memory when I least expect them. I know that the mine remains, a silent monument to lives lost and sins unatoned, waiting for the next soul brave or desperate enough to venture into its depths. Though the physical scars have long since healed, the experience has left an indelible mark on my soul. I have come to understand that some ghosts are not meant to be exorcised completely, but to remind us of the truths we must face within ourselves. My journey into the abandoned mine was not just a confrontation with a vengeful spirit, but a reckoning with my own inner darkness. A painful, cathartic step toward understanding the complexities of grief, guilt, and redemption. Even now, when the night is silent and the shadows lengthen, I sense that I am not entirely alone. The echo of that long-forgotten tragedy and the spectral whisper of the miner who once was consumed by it remain with me. A constant reminder that our pasts, no matter how we try to outrun them, always linger at the edge of our consciousness, waiting for a moment of vulnerability to reappear. My name is Leo McKinney. I am 45 years old. This happened in the summer of 2021, when I set out in my aging RV on a journey into Lassen Volcanic National Park. I'd spent most of my career chasing stories as a journalist and photographer, but this expedition was deeply personal. I was determined to document the abandoned mining towns scattered across the foothills, and more hauntingly, to confront the demons of my past. My father had died in a mining accident when I was a child, a tragedy that left behind a heavy burden of guilt and sorrow. I hoped that by visiting the ruins of the mines, perhaps I could finally piece together some measure of understanding, or even forgiveness, for the tragedies that had shaped my life. The drive up to the park was long and lonesome, the kind of journey where your thoughts echo against barren mountains and endless skies. My RV, a battered relic that creaked and groaned with every mile, proved as temperamental as my own nerves. Its engine sputtered intermittently along the narrow, winding roads, and I couldn't shake the nagging thought that, in this remote corner of the world, help would be a distant memory if anything went wrong. Still, the lure of forgotten stories and secrets buried under decades of dust pushed me onward. I arrived at a small clearing near what used to be a bustling mining town. Now, rusted equipment lay scattered among crumbling buildings, and nature had begun to reclaim the land. The centerpiece of the desolation was an abandoned mine, its entrance yawning open like a dark, uninviting mouth. Not far from there, I noticed the remnants of an old furnace, the former heart of the mining operation. Faded, nearly illegible inscriptions on the charred wall of the furnace warned, "Disturb not the shadow in the furnace." I felt that the words were meant for someone like me, a warning from a past long dead and yet still pulsing with sorrow. That first evening, I set up my modest campsite beside the ruins, parking the RV as close to the mine entrance as I dared. I spent some time outside reviewing the preliminary shots on my aging camera. The images were grainy and distorted, as if the equipment were struggling to capture the heavy weight of history. But there was something else in those photos. Faint, almost imperceptible shapes and figures lurking in the periphery. I tried to dismiss them as artifacts of light and shadow, but a seed of unease had been planted. As darkness fell, I sat in the RV listening to the wind howl through the nearby pines, a mournful sound that seemed to carry whispers from a time I'd long tried to forget. At first, the low murmur was barely noticeable, but soon it swelled into a chorus of voices, fragile, broken words, full of grief and regret. I told myself it was the wind playing tricks on my mind, a natural phenomenon amplified by the oppressive solitude of the abandoned town. Yet, even as I lay awake that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that those voices were pleading for acknowledgement. The next morning, determined to find answers, I ventured toward the mine. The daylight did little to dispel the heavy atmosphere that clung to the ruins. My boots crunched on broken glass and loose gravel as I walked slowly along the mine's entrance, each step echoing with the ghosts of the past. Near the mouth of the tunnel, I discovered remnants of old mining equipment. A rusted lantern, a battered helmet, and, most disturbingly, a faded photograph of a group of miners. One of the men in the picture bore an uncanny resemblance to my father, his eyes filled with the sorrow that mirrored my own hidden grief. I shivered as I stared at those faded faces, as though the very air around me was charged with memories of loss. Inside the mine, darkness swallowed me whole. I fumbled with my flashlight, the beam weak and flickering as I navigated the narrow corridors carved into the rock. The walls were pockmarked with the scars of long-forgotten explosions, and the scent of damp earth and decay filled my nostrils. As I pressed deeper into the maze-like tunnel, I began to notice strange markings carved into the stone, symbols and initials etched in a hasty, desperate scrawl. In one of the deepest recesses of the mine, I stumbled upon a small chamber. There, clinging to the far wall, was a charred journal. Its pages were half devoured by flame, but amidst the blackened fragments, I made out frantic scribbles about a terrible accident, a cave-in that had claimed the lives of many miners, including, it seemed, my father. The journal also mentioned an ominous presence known only as the Shadow in the Furnace, a force born of collective grief and guilt. My heart pounded as I read the journal's desperate words. With every sentence, the cold reality of that tragic day pressed down on me, stirring feelings I had long suppressed. I left the mine with the journal clutched tightly in my hand, a mixture of determination and dread fueling my steps back to the RV. That night, as I returned to my cramped sanctuary on wheels, the supernatural occurrences escalated. My equipment began to malfunction inexplicably. A sudden burst of static on the radio, photographs that developed with ghostly overlays of a figure in the background, and the recurring sound of heavy footsteps pacing around the RV. I kept expecting to see something, a silhouette at the edge of the light, a figure watching me from the doorway, but every time I looked, there was nothing but the oppressive darkness. It wasn't long before I caught a glimpse of the entity itself. I was outside, attempting to repair a minor issue with the RV's engine, when I saw it. A shape, half-formed and shifting like smoke, standing at the threshold of the mine entrance. It was unmistakably the outline of a miner. Ragged clothing, a face obscured by a dusty, tattered hat, and eyes that burned with a malevolent intensity. I froze, the wrench slipping from my grasp as the shadow seemed to study me with an unnerving calm. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it melted back into the darkness of the ruined mine, leaving me trembling and gasping for breath. Over the following days, the phenomenon only grew bolder. My RV, already plagued by mechanical issues, broke down completely one chilly morning, stranding me near the ghost town with no immediate prospect of repair. With no way to call for help and no modern signal to reach out, I was forced to leave the relative safety of the RV and venture on foot to scavenge for supplies. Everywhere I went, I felt the oppressive presence of that shadow. At dusk, the sound of clanging metal and distant, mournful voices would fill the air, a symphony of sorrow that seemed to draw me inexorably back toward the mine. I found myself returning to the mine's dark corridors time and again, driven by a desperate need for answers. Each foray into that abyss unearthed new horrors. Scattered tools arranged in chaotic disarray, walls scorched by flames that had long since died out, and eerie etchings that pulsed faintly in the dim light of my flashlight. In one cavernous room I discovered the remnants of the old furnace, still faintly glowing with embers, as if smoldering with the anguish of the past. Against one wall was a crude mural, a crude, hastily painted image of a miner clutching his chest, surrounded by shadowy figures. Alongside the mural, in shaky handwriting, was a single phrase repeated over and over: "Pay your dues." Late one night, driven by a mix of dread and determination, I ventured deeper into the mine than ever before. Armed only with my flashlight, camera, and a burning need to confront the truth about that fateful day, I pressed forward into a narrow, claustrophobic passageway. The air grew thick with the smell of sulfur and decay, and the walls seemed to close in around me. In the oppressive silence, I began to hear low, anguished whispers emanating from the very rock. Voices speaking of betrayal, of debts unpaid, and of a fate sealed by guilt. Then, in the suffocating darkness of a long-forgotten tunnel, I encountered it. The shadow in the furnace materialized fully before my eyes. A towering, spectral figure that radiated despair and anger. Its form was that of a miner, but twisted into something monstrous. Elongated limbs, a face contorted in eternal torment, and eyes that burned like smoldering coals. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, each heavy step sending tremors through the ground. The entity's presence was overwhelming, as if it carried within it the collective agony of every soul lost in that cursed mine. I stood frozen, paralyzed by fear and the crushing weight of my own memories. The apparition spoke in a guttural, sorrowful voice that reverberated deep inside my chest. It told me that the mine was cursed, that the sins of the past demanded to be remembered, and that my presence had stirred old wounds. As the ghost's eyes locked onto mine, I saw, for a brief, agonizing moment, flashes of my father's face. A broken man consumed by grief, his eyes reflecting regret and terror. The realization struck me hard. This entity was not merely a random specter, but the embodiment of all the guilt and sorrow that had haunted our family since that terrible day. In that raw, heart-wrenching moment, the apparition advanced slowly. With every step, I felt an intense, almost physical pain, a merging of my own buried anguish with the entity's relentless torment. My heart pounded so fiercely that I was sure it would shatter my ribs. Desperation surged through me, and I scrambled backwards along the slick, crumbling tunnel. The walls seemed to close in, as if the mine itself were collapsing under the weight of its misery. Behind me, the slow, deliberate footsteps of the shadow echoed like the tolling of a funeral bell. Cornered in a claustrophobic chamber lit only by the flickering glow of dying embers, I found myself face to face with the full force of the curse. The specter loomed over me, its burning eyes threatening to incinerate all semblance of rational thought. I realized, with a bone-deep certainty, that this confrontation was inevitable. I had been running from the memories, from the guilt of my father's death, and the silent blame I carried all these years. Now, in the presence of this tormented spirit, I was forced to confront the darkness I had long tried to ignore. Voice trembling and barely audible, I spoke into the oppressive silence. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." The words tumbled out, heavy with remorse and regret, as I acknowledged my own failures and the burden of guilt that had haunted me since that tragic day. In that agonizing moment of confession, the air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of my emotions. I poured out my heart, apologizing to the specter, to the lost souls of the mine, to the very earth that had witnessed so much sorrow. For what felt like an eternity, the spectral figure and I were locked in a silent communion, a desperate, fragile exchange between a haunted man and the embodiment of his collective grief. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the shadow's raging form began to waver. Its eyes softened, and the monstrous features seemed to lose a fraction of their malevolence. As if sated by my acknowledgement and contrition, the entity began to recede, dissolving gradually into the darkness of the tunnel, until it was nothing more than a lingering whisper on the wind. I staggered out of the depths of the mine, my body battered and my spirit raw, yet burdened with a strange, fragile sense of closure. The RV, long abandoned by its mechanical whims, sat waiting at the edge of the ruins, a silent witness to the tragedy and redemption that had unfolded within those haunted corridors. I climbed back into its creaking interior and, with one final glance at the dark mouth of the mine, set off toward the distant lights of civilization. The journey out was a blur of shattered reflections and muted whispers, a reminder that some tragedies never truly fade, but can be acknowledged and, perhaps, forgiven. Oh, I returned to the world of the living with my camera filled with ghostly images and my journal heavy with confessions. I never finished that documentary, nor did I seek public acclaim for what I had experienced. Instead, I carried those memories with me, a bittersweet testament to the fact that our pasts, no matter how painful, are inseparable parts of who we are. Now, as I sit in the quiet of my modest apartment, I often find myself staring into mirrors or gazing out of rain-streaked windows, wondering if the darkness of that cursed mine still lingers somewhere in the recesses of my mind. The image of the shadow in the furnace, with its burning eyes and tormented form, flashes in my memory when I least expect it. I know that the mine remains, a silent monument to lives lost and sins unatoned, waiting for the next soul brave or desperate enough to venture into its depths. Though the physical scars have long since healed, the experience left an indelible mark on my soul. I have come to understand that some ghosts are not meant to be exorcised completely, but are there to remind us of the truths we must face within ourselves. My journey into that abandoned mine was not merely a confrontation with a vengeful spirit. It was a reckoning with my own inner darkness, a painful and cathartic step toward understanding the complexities of grief, guilt, and redemption. Even now, when the night is silent and shadows stretch long across the pavement, I sense that I am not entirely alone. The echo of that long-forgotten tragedy and the spectral whisper of a miner lost to despair remain with me. A constant reminder that our pasts, however deeply buried, always linger at the edge of our consciousness, waiting for a moment of vulnerability to reappear. I continue my work, writing and photographing, not only to create but to understand, and perhaps, in some quiet way, to atone. The memory of that summer will forever be etched into my heart, a somber chapter in a life defined by both loss and the enduring search for forgiveness. And every so often, when a cold breeze stirs the night, or a faint whisper rides the wind, I am reminded that some ghosts never truly leave us. They live on, urging us to face our own shadows in the quiet moments between dusk and dawn. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 52 years old. This happened in the fall of 2022, when I decided to escape the relentless echoes of a painful divorce and the haunting regrets of lost love by renting an old RV and venturing deep into the Shasta Trinity National Forest. I craved solitude, a quiet retreat amid towering pines and mist-shrouded trails near the remote slopes of Mount Shasta, hoping that isolation might help me rediscover the spark of creativity I'd long thought extinguished. The drive was long and lonesome. My vintage RV, with its faded floral upholstery and a dashboard that flickered uncertainly, seemed as nostalgic and temperamental as my own heart. The engine coughed and sputtered along narrow, winding roads, and every so often, the radio would fill with nothing but static. In those moments, I felt more isolated than ever, cut adrift from the world by miles of dense forest and rugged hills. Yet, there was something in the untamed wilderness that beckoned me, a promise of healing, or perhaps an invitation to confront the ghosts of my past. I arrived at a small clearing at the edge of a dense stand of pines. Here, the forest opened up to reveal a quiet glade with a modest campsite, and beyond it, the rugged slopes of Mount Shasta loomed in the distance, half hidden by swirling mists. I spent the first day setting up my temporary home. As I unpacked and arranged my few belongings around the RV, I couldn't help but notice that even in daylight, the forest seemed to whisper secrets. I caught fleeting glimpses of a figure moving silently among the trees, a shadow too deliberate to be a trick of the light, vanishing when I turned my head. That night, as I sat on the steps of my RV with a steaming cup of coffee, the isolation of the wilderness settled over me like a heavy cloak. The pines rustled softly in the gentle wind, but beneath that natural melody I began to discern something else, a low murmur, almost like distant whispers. I listened intently, straining to catch the words, but they were too faint, more like the rustling of leaves than any coherent speech. Yet, as I sipped my coffee, I felt certain that there was someone, or something, watching from the darkness beyond the RV's light. The next morning, while I was checking the area around my campsite, I discovered an unusual set of footprints pressed into the soft, damp earth near the base of an old, towering pine. They were oddly large, and clearly not made by any animal I recognized. My pulse quickened as I followed the trail with cautious steps. The prints led toward a thicket at the edge of the clearing, then abruptly ended near a clump of ferns. I knelt down, examining the ground, and noticed a few small metallic glints among the fallen leaves. They resembled fragments of old, tarnished metal, perhaps remnants of an era long past. Over the next few days, my RV began to show signs of its age more aggressively. The heater malfunctioned on cold nights, and the cell signal was so unreliable that I often felt completely cut off from the world. Each time the engine coughed to a halt on a lonely stretch of road, I was forced to stop and perform minor repairs with a toolkit that had seen better days. In these moments, as I worked by the light of a weak headlamp, the forest around me seemed to grow even darker and more secretive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly shifting in the periphery of my vision. At dusk one evening, while I was reading in the RV, I noticed something that made my heart skip. A pair of luminescent eyes, reflecting the RV's interior light, peering from behind a stand of trees just beyond my campsite. I froze, every nerve on edge. The eyes were gone the next moment, swallowed by the growing darkness, leaving behind only an unshakable sense of being observed. That night, the wind's whispers grew more insistent, and an unexplainable tapping echoed against the RV's windows. Sleep eluded me as I lay awake, the rhythmic tapping mingling with the whispers. I couldn't tell if it was just the wind playing tricks on me or if something else was at work. My thoughts kept returning to the old local legends I'd read about. The stories of a tormented spirit wandering these woods, the restless ghost of a long-forgotten prospector cursed to roam the forest for his sins. I dismissed such tales as mere folklore, yet in that moment, my heart pounded with a fear that was not entirely unfounded. One particularly stormy night, as thunder rumbled in the distance and rain battered the roof of the RV, I decided to step outside. The storm's fury made the forest seem even more mysterious. A chaotic blend of wind, rain, and flickering shadows. I wrapped myself in a heavy jacket and walked toward the source of the persistent tapping. There, amidst the downpour, I saw it clearly. A gaunt, nearly spectral figure standing motionless at the edge of a clearing. Its form was ragged and thin, with elongated limbs that seemed to merge with the shadows. The creature's eyes, a luminous, unsettling shade, met mine. For a long, heart-stopping moment, we simply regarded each other in silence. I wanted to flee, but something within me, Perhaps the deep aching loneliness that had driven me into the forest compelled me to stay. I took a hesitant step forward. The figure did not move but continued to watch me, its expression unreadable. The wind whipped around us, carrying with it the murmur of voices that I could no longer ignore. They were not words, but a sound of mourning, as if the very forest were grieving an ancient loss. In the following days, I noticed other strange signs. My camera, which I used to capture the beauty of the forest, began to record odd images, a blurred, ghostly figure in the background of many shots. On several occasions, I found old relics in the vicinity of my campsite. A rusted prospector's pick, a tattered piece of clothing, and even a small, weathered notebook with cryptic entries referencing lost fortunes and cursed debts. These relics seemed to be calling to me, tying my journey to the old legends of the region. At first, the silent stalker, if that was what I now believed the mysterious entity to be, appeared only at a distance. I caught glimpses of it at dawn when I sipped my coffee on the RV steps, or at dusk when it lurked behind clusters of trees. Its presence was unnerving but not overtly hostile. Yet, as the days passed, I felt its gaze grow more intense, more invasive. It began to encroach closer to my campsite, leaving behind odd markings on nearby trees and small trinkets that I could not explain. Late one afternoon, while trying to repair the RV's failing heater, I heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. I looked up from my work, heart thumping, and saw the silent stalker emerge from the gloom of the pines. The creature moved with an eerie grace, its every step silent as if floating over the leaf-littered ground. When it came to a stop just a few yards from where I stood, the eyes locked with mine once more. In that frozen moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow emanating from the figure. A grief so profound that it resonated with the pain I had been carrying for years. Overwhelmed by a mix of fear and an inexplicable empathy, I called out softly, "What do you want from me?" The creature did not answer in words. Instead, the rain and thunder swallowed my voice, and it remained silent, its gaze unwavering. That night, my dreams were haunted by vivid images. I saw the silent stalker moving through golden fields of long-forgotten memories, reaching out as if pleading for redemption, and I found myself trapped in a labyrinth of regret and lost time. I awoke drenched in sweat, my heart racing, unable to tell where my dreams ended and reality began. On the final night of my stay, a violent thunderstorm raged overhead, trapping me inside the RV. The wind howled as the forest seemed to come alive with restless movement. Determined to confront the presence that had so persistently haunted my every moment, I stepped outside into the torrential rain. The downpour blurred the world around me, and for a moment, I lost all sense of direction. But then, as lightning illuminated the clearing, I saw it clearly. The silent stalker, standing alone in an open space, bathed in the sporadic silver flashes of the storm. With trembling resolve, I walked toward the figure. Rain hammered my face and the wind nearly tore the words from my lips as I approached. The creature stood motionless, its luminous eyes fixed on me. In that charged moment, as thunder roared and the forest quivered, I found my voice, not as a challenge but as a plea for understanding. I know what it's like to be lost, to be haunted by regret, I said, my voice barely audible above the storm. I'm tired of running from my own ghosts. Please help me let go. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. The creature's eyes, which had burned with an intensity that frightened me to my core, softened. In the brief intervals between the flashes of lightning, I could see something in its expression, a mirror of my own sorrow and longing for forgiveness. Then, as if accepting my silent request, The silent stalker slowly stepped back into the shadows. In its wake, the rain revealed something glinting on the ground. A small, weathered medallion etched with the symbols of the Gold Rush era. I picked it up, feeling the cool metal against my skin, as if it were a tangible token of absolution. When the storm finally subsided and dawn broke, the oppressive weight of isolation seemed to lift ever so slightly. The forest, though still mysterious and somber, felt somehow less hostile. I repaired what I could of my RV and packed up my few belongings, the medallion safely tucked into my pocket. A quiet reminder that even the most tormented souls might find release. As I drove away from that secluded clearing, the images of the silent stalker and the haunting whispers of the forest lingered in my mind. I never fully determined whether the creature was a supernatural entity or simply a manifestation of my own inner pain and regret. Perhaps it was a little of both. A ghost of a long-forgotten prospector doomed to wander these woods, or maybe just a mirror reflecting the sorrow of all who have loved and lost. All I knew was that the encounter had changed me. I felt a cautious hope stirring within, an inkling that acknowledging one's darkest memories can sometimes pave the way for healing. Now, months later, I find that the medallion still rests on my bedside table, a silent reminder of that transformative night in the Shasta Trinity National Forest. In the quiet moments before sleep, I often catch myself glancing toward it, wondering if the silent stalker ever truly left those woods or if it lingers still in the shadows of my memories. I continue my journey as a writer, channeling the pain and beauty of that encounter into my work, determined to honor the past while forging a path toward a kinder, more forgiving future. Sometimes, when a gust of wind rattles the windows of my modest apartment, or when the twilight casts long, eerie shadows across the floor, I remember that stormy night and the silent figure beneath the pines. I realize that our pasts, no matter how painful, often hold the key to our future. In confronting my own ghosts, I have learned that forgiveness, both for others and for myself, is not a destination, but a journey. And every now and then, when the night is quiet and the memories whisper softly, I know that I am not as alone as I once feared. That is the story of my journey into the heart of darkness and, ultimately, into the light of understanding. A testament to the healing power of facing the ghosts that dwell in both the forest and within our own hearts. My name is Sam Walker. I am 30 years old. This happened last summer when I set out alone in my aging RV into the heart of Redwood National Park. I was barely holding on to my sanity after the sudden tragic death of my best friend on a hiking trip, a loss that left me drowning in guilt and questions that I could never answer. I needed to get away, to find some sort of solace or closure in the only place that had ever truly called to me, the wild, untamed forest. I figured that if I could capture some beauty and maybe even some answers on film, I might finally start to come to terms with my own demons. The journey started out with a restless excitement. My vintage RV, a relic with peeling paint and a stubborn engine, sputtered along narrow, winding roads. I had long ago accepted that its mechanical failures were just part of the charm and the challenge of life on the road. Yet, out here in the dense forest, every unexpected halt or broken radio signal reminded me that I was utterly alone, far from any help if things went awry. After several hours of driving, I reached an isolated canyon deep in the redwood groves. The towering trees, their bark ancient and knotted, closed in around a small clearing that I decided would be my campsite. I parked the RV on a patch of soft ground surrounded by ferns and moss, with a narrow trail leading off into the shadowy depths of the forest. I unloaded my gear and set up a small camp, trying to shake the nagging feeling that the forest itself was watching me. That first night was restless. The silence of the canyon was punctuated by the steady chorus of nocturnal creatures. Yet, beneath the natural sounds, I began to pick up something else. As the wind whistled through the canyon walls, it carried with it eerie, mournful howls, sounds that, at first, I dismissed as distant animal calls. But as the night deepened, those howls grew in intensity and seemed to take on a strangely articulate quality. In between the howls, I thought I heard faint whispers, almost as if they were calling out in voices I recognized but could not quite place. Sleep was elusive, and I lay awake in the cramped confines of my RV, my mind churning with memories of my friend's final moments, a lapse in judgment on a treacherous trail, a moment of silence before a fatal plunge. I wondered if I was haunted by guilt, or if something else was in the air out here that preyed on my sorrow. The next morning, while reviewing some of the photographs I'd taken in the early light, I noticed something odd. In several shots, barely visible behind clusters of redwoods, was a blurred, shadowy figure, a gaunt silhouette that seemed to shift and blend into the forest background. At first, I assumed it was just a trick of light and my jittery nerves. But as the day wore on, I began to notice more anomalies. My camera's images sometimes came out with odd, ghostly overlays. Other times, personal items from my RV were inexplicably moved. A notebook I was sure I'd left on the table was found on the floor, and a pair of gloves I'd hung by the door had vanished. I set out on a walk around my campsite to clear my head. The forest was a labyrinth of giant redwoods and tangled undergrowth. I followed a narrow trail along the canyon's edge, the crunch of leaves under my boots echoing in the crisp morning air. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon something unsettling, a series of deep gouges carved into the bark of a massive tree. The marks were crude, as if made by an animal or a person in a state of desperate urgency. Nearby, the soft earth bore large, uneven footprints. They were too big to belong to any known local wildlife, and they exuded a sense of foreboding. I snapped a few photos, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the forest was bathed in twilight, the howls returned, louder and more insistent. I sat outside the RV, trying to focus on the rhythmic pounding of my heart, when something caught my eye. Out at the far edge of the clearing, nestled in a stand of trees, a pair of eyes glowed faintly in the dying light. I froze, watching as they lingered for a few agonizing seconds before vanishing behind the trees. My pulse pounded in my ears as I struggled to convince myself that it was nothing more than a trick of the light, or my imagination playing games with me. That night, I lay in my bunk, listening as the wind and rain combined to create a haunting symphony outside. I could barely recall falling asleep, but my dreams were tormented by flashbacks of my friend's laughter, his last anguished cry, and a shadowy presence that loomed in the background. An indistinct figure with hollow, glowing eyes that seemed to weep sorrow. Days passed in a blur of mechanical mishaps and mounting dread. My RV's engine, already temperamental, began to break down more frequently. I was forced to stop on isolated stretches of road to perform minor repairs, each pause deepening my isolation. Without reliable cell service, every breakdown felt like a descent further into the wilderness. A world apart from civilization where only the forest's secrets reigned. Then came the day when everything seemed to converge. I was out repairing a minor issue with the heater when I heard footsteps approaching. At first, I thought it was just a curious animal, but then I saw it. A gaunt, spectral figure emerging slowly from the gloom of the pines. The figure moved with a silent, predatory grace, its elongated limbs almost blending with the shadows. Its eyes, when they met mine, glowed with an eerie, soft light that sent a chill straight to my core. For a long, frozen moment, we simply regarded each other. I could not tell if the creature was studying me or if I was merely a reflection of its own sorrow. I called out, voice trembling, but the figure did not respond. It simply turned and drifted away, leaving me with a sense of profound loss and an unsettling familiarity, as if it carried the weight of countless tragedies. The encounter left me reeling, and I began to wonder if the creature, whom I'd started to refer to in my mind as the Wailer, was more than just a figment of my grief-stricken imagination. That night, the sound of the wind was punctuated by an unmistakable, mournful wail, almost as if the forest itself were crying out in anguish. The echoes of that sound merged with my own inner turmoil, dredging up memories of my lost friend and the mistakes that had led to his untimely death. I couldn't tell if the wails were coming from outside the RV or from the depths of my own soul. In the flickering light of a lone lantern, I scribbled in my journal, desperate to capture every detail before my mind betrayed me with further hallucinations. As the days bled together, the encounters with the Wailer grew bolder. I began to notice small, almost ritualistic symbols carved into the dirt near my RV. Symbols that looked like desperate messages left by someone or something that had suffered profound loss. At times, I'd find personal items from the RV inexplicably scattered about, as if the entity were trying to communicate through them. And every evening, as darkness settled over the canyon, I could feel that intense, inescapable gaze watching me from the depths of the forest. It all came to a head one violent night. A thunderstorm roared to life with a ferocity I had never experienced before. Rain pounded the roof of the RV and lightning split the sky into stark, white fragments. I knew that tonight would be different. The atmosphere was charged with a wild, almost malevolent energy, and the relentless howls of the wind were now joined by a chorus of anguished wails that seemed to vibrate through the very earth. With no shelter strong enough to block the storm's fury, I resolved to step outside. Clad in a rain-soaked jacket, I forced myself from the relative safety of the RV. The tempest made it nearly impossible to see, and the forest was transformed into a chaotic world of shifting shadows and blinding flashes of lightning. I made my way carefully toward the center of the clearing, my heart pounding with each step. Then, in a moment of terrifying clarity, I saw it again. The Wailer, standing motionless in a small opening among the trees. The figure was illuminated intermittently by the lightning, a gaunt, shifting silhouette with eyes that glowed sorrowfully in the storm's sporadic light. The sound of the wind, the pounding of the rain, and the creature's own mournful cry created an otherworldly cacophony that overwhelmed my senses. I couldn't hold back my emotions any longer. With the storm raging around me, I called out, my voice raw with grief and desperation. "I'm sorry, man. I'm so sorry." The words, meant for my lost friend, seemed to hang in the air, merging with the sound of the storm. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, in the silence between thunderclaps, the Wailer began to move slowly toward me. Its approach was measured and deliberate, each step a blend of sorrow and inevitability. As the creature drew near, I could see that its face was not one of pure menace, but rather a mask of perpetual torment, a reflection of all the grief that had been left unspoken in these ancient woods. The rain soaked me to the bone as I stood there, confronting the embodiment of my own guilt and loss. "I know what it's like to be haunted," I said, voice trembling with vulnerability and raw emotion. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love, to feel the weight of your mistakes. Please, help me find a way to let go." The Wailer halted a few feet away, its eyes never leaving mine. In that charged moment, the storm seemed to quiet for a heartbeat, and I could almost hear sound. A soft, mournful sigh that resonated deep within me. It was as if the creature was acknowledging my pain, mirroring the grief I had tried so desperately to suppress. And then, as quickly as it had come, the creature stepped back and faded into the swirling darkness of the trees. When the storm finally began to subside, I noticed something glinting on the rain-soaked ground where the whaler had stood. Crouching down, I picked up a small, weathered medallion, its surface etched with symbols reminiscent of the gold rush era. It was cool and heavy in my hand, a tangible token left behind by the creature, or perhaps by fate itself. I tucked the medallion into my jacket, feeling that it somehow symbolized a chance for absolution, a small step toward forgiving myself. The next morning, the forest was eerily calm. The storm had passed, leaving behind a misty silence and droplets of rain sparkling on the redwood trunks. I managed to get my RV running again with some makeshift repairs, and as I drove away from that isolated canyon, I couldn't shake the profound impact of that night. The memory of the whaler's luminous eyes and its sorrowful, wordless plea for understanding lingered in my mind like a half-remembered dream. I don't know if the creature was a real supernatural entity or a manifestation of my own tortured grief, a reflection of the guilt that had haunted me since my friend's death. Perhaps it was both. The boundaries between the natural and the paranormal blurred out there in the depths of the redwoods, and all I could do was accept that some mysteries are meant to remain unresolved. Now, months later, I still keep that medallion close. It sits on my desk as a reminder that even in the midst of unspeakable loss and despair, there is a chance for healing. I continue my work as a photographer and writer, capturing the beauty and the terror of the natural world, always searching for a way to piece together the fragments of my broken past. Every now and then, when the wind howls through my apartment, or a shadow seems to linger too long at the edge of my vision, I think back to that stormy night in the canyon and the sorrowful gaze of the whaler. I've come to understand that sometimes the ghosts we face are not entirely external. They are born from within, forged in the fires of regret and loss. Facing them head-on, as painful as it may be, is the only way to find closure. That night, in the howling depths of Redwood National Park, I finally began to understand that forgiveness starts with accepting our own frailties, our own capacity to love and to lose. And though the memory of that spectral figure still haunts me in quiet moments, it also reminds me that even the darkest grief can, in time, give way to a small, fragile hope. That is my story. A journey into a forest of towering redwoods and even taller sorrows, where the past and the present converge in a single haunting moment. I leave the wilderness behind now, but its lessons remain with me, etched into my heart like the faded symbols carved into ancient bark. And every time I see a flash of light in the shadows or hear the distant echo of a mournful howl, I remember that night, the eyes of the whaler, and the promise that I am not beyond redemption. My name is Mia Alvarez. I am 27 years old. This happened last autumn when I decided to escape the frenetic pulse of city life and confront the nightmares that had haunted my sleep for years. I rented an old RV and drove out to the Mojave National Preserve, drawn by an inexplicable pull toward the barren, timeless desert. A place where endless dunes and rugged rock formations hide secrets older than memory. I hoped that in the oppressive solitude of the Mojave, I might finally unearth some clarity about the cryptic dreams that plagued me. Dreams that hinted at a dark family legacy I could neither remember nor escape. The journey out of the city was both liberating and unnerving. My vintage RV, with its creaking frame and a stubborn engine that seemed to protest every mile, was as unreliable as my own beating heart. Its satellite phone and navigation system often failed in the vast electromagnetic void of the desert, forcing me to rely on paper maps and instinct. Each unexpected breakdown or unplanned stop deepened my isolation, but also added to the eerie atmosphere that had begun to seep into my bones long before I reached the Mojave. I arrived at a remote stretch of the preserve in the late afternoon. The sun was a burning orb in a cloudless sky, casting long shadows over the sand and scattered boulders. I parked the RV near a dried-up desert oasis, a cracked basin surrounded by ancient rock outcroppings. The silence was palpable, broken only by the distant murmur of wind over the dunes. I set up my modest camp and tried to shake off the first pricklings of unease. After all, I told myself this was just another road trip, a chance to gather inspiration for my writing and perhaps capture some haunting photographs of the desert landscape. That first night, as darkness fell and the desert cooled into an oppressive stillness, I sat outside my RV with a cup of lukewarm coffee. The heat of the day had given way to an eerie chill, and the wind began to carry low-frequency hums, sounds that were almost musical in their cadence, yet laced with a profound sorrow. At first, I dismissed them as the natural symphony of a desert at night, but as the hours stretched on, the hums grew into murmurs, and I began to hear indistinct words, snatches of phrases that reminded me, disturbingly, of the whispered voices from my nightmares. I strained to catch each syllable, but they slipped away like dust in the wind. In the following days, strange occurrences became more frequent. While exploring a rocky outcrop near my campsite, I discovered cryptic symbols crudely carved into the sun-bleached stone. The designs were unlike any modern graffiti. They had an ancient, almost ritualistic quality that sent a chill down my spine. Later, I found similar markings etched in the soft clay near the dried-up water's edge. I couldn't tell if they were the work of someone long gone, or if they had been left recently by an unknown hand. The resemblance of the symbols to those in my dreams made my skin crawl. Back at the RV, equipment malfunctions compounded my growing unease. The satellite phone would randomly buzz with static that sometimes resolved into snatches of distorted voices. My camera, which I had intended to use to capture the surreal beauty of the Mojave, began recording faint, ghostly images in the background, figures that appeared for a single frame before vanishing into nothingness. Personal items I was certain I had left undisturbed would inexplicably change places. One morning, I awoke to find a small sketchbook, one I'd never seen before, lying open on the dashboard. Its pages were filled with sketches of a robed figure and bizarre symbols that mirrored those carved in the rocks. At first, I tried to convince myself that exhaustion and isolation were playing tricks on my mind. But the desert has a way of stripping away illusions. One evening, as I sat in the dim light of the RV watching the sunset paint the dunes in surreal hues of orange and purple, I caught a fleeting glimpse of something moving at the edge of my vision. I turned quickly, but saw nothing, only the vast emptiness of the Mojave stretching out into the horizon. Later that night, while lying awake on the creaky cot, I thought I saw a shimmering outline moving just outside the broken window. It was too fluid, too shifting to be a trick of the light. It vanished as soon as I focused on it, leaving me trembling with a blend of fear and fascination. My dreams grew increasingly vivid and disturbing. Night after night, I was plagued by visions of a mysterious, ever-changing figure, sometimes appearing as a robed specter with a featureless, shifting face, and other times as a monstrous silhouette with elongated limbs and too many glimmering eyes. In these dreams, the entity would move silently across barren landscapes, its presence accompanied by an otherworldly glow that distorted reality around it. More troubling were the moments when the creature's form would merge with images of my own family, hints of a legacy filled with unspoken secrets and unacknowledged loss. I woke each morning drenched in sweat, the boundary between dream and waking life blurring into uncertainty. A particularly scorching day arrived when my RV's engine began to sputter more violently than ever before. Forced to pull over on an isolated stretch of highway, I set out to inspect the engine. As I knelt beside the hood, the oppressive heat seemed to warp the air itself. That's when I noticed something unusual. Amidst the dusty ground, a set of footprints led away from the vehicle. They were large, uneven, and disturbingly human in shape, yet with an animalistic stride. Following the trail with hesitant steps, I soon came upon a cluster of ancient boulders, their surfaces etched with the same cryptic symbols I had seen elsewhere. Lying among them was a broken piece of fabric, dark and tattered, which smelled faintly of sweat and old sorrow. I snapped several photos, my hands shaking, uncertain if my mind was conjuring ghosts from the desert's heat. That evening, as a violent sandstorm began to brew on the horizon, I decided to return to my RV and wait out the tempest. The winds picked up with alarming speed, and I could hear the sand hissing and swirling as if whispering secrets of ages past. I secured the RV as best as I could and settled inside, my heart thudding in anticipation of what might come. Then, amid the roar of the storm, the atmosphere shifted. The wind's howls were suddenly interlaced with a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the very walls of the RV. I strained to listen, and amidst the tumult I thought I heard a voice, a soft, mournful tone that sounded almost like a plea. The sound was not mechanical, not animalistic, but something distinctly human, though laced with a timbre that sent chills down my spine. I clutched my blanket tighter, feeling both terror and an inexplicable pull to understand what it meant. Unable to bear the confines of the failing RV any longer, I decided to venture out into the storm in search of shelter among a cluster of ancient boulders nearby. The wind was fierce, whipping my hair and tearing at my clothes as I struggled to maintain my footing. Every step was a battle against the elements, every moment a blur of driving rain and stinging sand. The world had become a disorienting dance of light and shadow, and I felt as though I were drifting into a surreal alternate reality. In the midst of this chaos, the storm seemed to part just enough to reveal a figure standing motionless in the center of a small clearing. There, illuminated intermittently by jagged bolts of lightning, stood the entity I had only seen in my nightmares. A robed, amorphous figure whose form shifted with the wind. Its face was a void of swirling darkness, yet in the fleeting flashes of lightning I could see eyes burning with an uncanny, shifting light. I froze, heart hammering in my chest, as the creature's presence dominated the desolate landscape. The entity did not speak in words, but a powerful, wordless communication surged through my mind. A torrent of images, emotions, and memories. I saw visions of my ancestors, of a family burdened by secrets and sorrow. I saw fragments of rituals performed under starlit skies and heard the echo of ancient incantations. In that moment, the entity made it clear. It was not merely a specter of the desert, but a living embodiment of the legacy that had haunted my dreams. It was known in whispered legends and half-forgotten lore as the Shifting One, a nomad of the sands, cursed to wander the Mojave, bound to the dark secrets of the past. Overwhelmed by an intense mixture of terror and profound sorrow, I fell to my knees in the midst of the storm. The creature's gaze, if one could call it that, seemed to pierce through my very soul, and in that vulnerable instant I realized that I might be connected to this ancient curse. Perhaps my recurring nightmares, the mysterious symbols, and the inexplicable pull I felt towards the desert were all part of a legacy I could no longer ignore. My mind raced, torn between the desire to flee and the desperate need to understand. With the raging sandstorm as my only witness, I managed to choke out, "Who? What are you? What do you want from me?" My voice was barely audible above the howl of the wind. In response, the shifting one advanced slowly, its form undulating like heat on the horizon. In the brief, terrifying silence between thunderclaps, I felt a surge of raw emotion, a mix of fear, grief, and a desperate yearning for absolution. It was as though the creature was offering me a chance to confront the darkest parts of my own soul. For what felt like an eternity, the desert was our stage, a chaotic interplay of wind, sand, and raw human emotion. The shifting one communicated not in words, but in images that crashed over me. Fragments of a hidden family history, memories of love lost, and the heavy burden of secrets passed down through generations. I saw flashes of a woman I barely remembered, a matriarch whose eyes held the same sorrowful intensity as the entities. I realized with a shock that left me gasping for breath that perhaps I was inheriting more than just a family name. I was inheriting a legacy of unspoken curses and forgotten rituals. The confrontation reached its climax as the storm began to relent, the furious winds dying down to a haunting murmur. In the wan light of a hesitant dawn, the shifting one slowly receded into the swirling mist that rose from the heated sands. In the spot where it had stood, I noticed a small, broken piece of a talisman glinting in the pale light, a token etched with cryptic symbols that matched those I had seen carved into the rocks and in my dreams. Trembling, I picked it up, its cold metal grounding me in the reality of what had just transpired. I spent the remainder of that day gathering my scattered thoughts and attempting to repair my battered RV. With the talisman clutched in my hand, I felt that I had been granted a small measure of understanding, a chance to piece together the fragments of my family's dark legacy and perhaps begin to free myself from its oppressive grip. The desert, with its vast emptiness and relentless beauty, had forced me to confront not only the external manifestation of ancient forces, but also the internal echoes of my own vulnerability and grief. Eventually, I managed to fix enough of the RV's failing systems to resume my journey back toward civilization. As I drove away from the desolate expanse of the Mojave, the images of that harrowing night, the relentless sandstorm, the shifting, spectral figure, the poignant exchange of emotions, remained seared into my memory. I could not say for sure whether the shifting one was a genuine supernatural entity or merely a projection of my own tormented psyche, shaped by dreams and the desert's unyielding isolation. Perhaps the truth lay somewhere in between, an ambiguous blend of the metaphysical and the deeply personal. Now, back in the relative safety of everyday life, I keep the broken talisman close, a small reminder of the night the desert whispered its secrets to me. Occasionally, when a stray gust of wind carries the faintest echo of that low, haunting hum, or when I glimpse a symbol carved in an unexpected place, I am transported back to that moment in the Mojave. I have since begun to document my experiences, writing down every detail in the hope that I might one day piece together the true nature of my heritage and the legacy of the shifting one. Even though the nightmares persist in quiet moments, and the memory of that stormy confrontation still haunts my dreams, I have found within myself a cautious resolve to face my past. The desert taught me that sometimes the only way to overcome the ghosts that torment us is to embrace them, to acknowledge the shadows within and let them guide us toward a fragile yet hard-won sense of healing. That is my story, a journey into the harsh, echoing emptiness of the Mojave, where reality blurred with nightmare, and where I was forced to confront the legacy of my own lineage, written in the shifting sands and whispered on the wind. I drive on now, both literally and metaphorically, carrying the weight of that experience as a reminder that some echoes of the past can never be silenced, but that, with time and understanding, they might finally begin to fade into the light. My name is Casey Ward. I am 34 years old. This happened one gloomy autumn, when I decided to leave behind the unbearable weight of my past and seek refuge in the remote depths of the Angeles National Forest. I had been a detective once, but those days were long gone, replaced by sleepless nights, endless flashbacks, and a nagging guilt over a case that had never been solved. The disappearance of a soldier whose memory still haunted me. I rented an old RV, a stubborn relic with creaks and sputters that somehow matched my own battered spirit, and set out toward the rugged foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains, where forgotten battlefields and abandoned military sites lay hidden beneath the canopy of whispering pines. The drive was long and solitary. My RV's engine coughed and choked along winding, narrow roads, and every time its outdated radio or navigation system failed me, I was reminded just how isolated I was. I spent hours lost in thought, replaying every detail of that unsolved case. The desperate phone call, the frantic search, the final silence that followed when help never came. The unresolved guilt, the feeling that I could have done more, never left me. It was as if that missing soldier had become a permanent shadow, a silent accusation of my failures. With each mile, I hoped that the isolation of the forest would give me the space to confront those demons, to find some measure of redemption. I arrived late one afternoon at a remote clearing in the forest. The area was unforgiving, a tangle of ancient pines and rugged terrain, punctuated by the remnants of old military markers and rusted relics that time had all but forgotten. I parked the RV on a patch of ground that was uneven and rough, its surface barely disturbed by footsteps for decades. As I stepped out, the crisp air filled my lungs, but an unspoken heaviness clung to every sound around me. That evening, while tinkering with the RV's faulty radio, I began picking up strange transmissions. At first, it was nothing more than static, but gradually, the static resolved into fragments of military chatter. I could just make out the voice of a soldier, a low, sorrowful tone speaking in hushed, clipped phrases that I couldn't quite decipher. It was as if the past were trying to reach out to me, or perhaps remind me of what I'd lost. I jotted down the times and frequencies, trying to make sense of the fragmented messages, though I couldn't shake the feeling that they carried a message meant just for me. In the days that followed, I set out on routine walks around my campsite. One morning, as I trailed a narrow path lined with overgrown brush, I stumbled upon something that sent a shiver down my spine. A dilapidated gravestone partially hidden by tangled underbrush. The stone was weathered, its inscriptions worn away by time, but I could just make out a date and a set of initials that stirred a memory from my past. I knew that somewhere, in the dusty archives of unsolved cases, this monument belonged to a soldier lost long ago, a man whose fate I had never been able to resolve. Nearby, the ground bore large, irregular footprints that were too clumsy to be from any modern person, leading off into the denser parts of the forest toward what looked like an abandoned military outpost. Every day brought new signs that something was not right. I began to notice eerie discrepancies in the photographs I took. In several shots of the forest, I saw a blurred figure, a man in faded military uniform, standing in the background, his face etched with sorrow. I first thought these were mere tricks of light or errors in the old camera, but the consistency with which the figure appeared over several days convinced me that it was something more. I even found an old military patch and a torn scrap of paper with a handwritten note tucked away in a crevice near my RV. The note mentioned a date and a plea for help, written in a shaky hand that seemed all too familiar. It was as if the forest was laying breadcrumbs, urging me to look deeper. At night, the isolation of the forest grew oppressive. The silence was broken only by the incessant rustling of the wind through the pines and the occasional, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps around the RV. I would lie awake in the cramped interior, listening to the RV's old engine settle, feeling as though I were being watched by unseen eyes. The nightmares came too, vivid flashbacks of the missing soldiers' final moments, a cacophony of desperate voices, and the image of a spectral figure standing guard over a forgotten graveyard. In these dreams, the figure, gaunt and somber in an old, tattered uniform, seemed to call out to me with a silent plea for acknowledgement and justice. One stormy night, when the RV's unreliable systems faltered under torrential rain and howling winds, I was forced to leave the relative safety of my vehicle. With no other shelter in sight, I grabbed my flashlight and a jacket and headed out into the storm. The rain pounded down, and the forest transformed into a chaotic labyrinth of shifting shadows and blinding flashes of lightning. I navigated by instinct, following a narrow trail that I hoped would lead to some form of cover. As I trudged along, the RV's silhouette shrank behind me, and I felt utterly alone, abandoned to the fury of the storm and the secrets of the ancient forest. In the midst of the tempest, a sudden, piercing flash of lightning illuminated a clearing ahead. There, in the center of the open space, I saw him, the silent vigil. The spectral figure stood motionless among a scattering of weathered headstones and tattered remnants of old military flags. He wore a uniform that belonged to another era, his features gaunt and etched with sorrow, his eyes burning with an otherworldly light, locked onto mine as if he had been waiting all these years for this moment. The sound of the storm seemed to fade away, replaced by an oppressive silence that filled the air with the weight of unspoken tragedies. I stood rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest as the apparition slowly advanced. There was no malice in his movement, only a profound sadness, as if he carried the grief of all those lost and forgotten. I could almost feel the silent accusation in his gaze, a reminder of the unsolved case that had haunted me for so long. Summoning all the courage I had left, I took a step forward and then another, until I was close enough to see the intricate details of his uniform. A faded insignia, a patch worn by time, and a name barely discernible beneath layers of grime. It was the same name I had searched for in cold case files, a name that had long been shrouded in mystery and regret. The storm raged around us, but in that electrifying moment, it felt as though time itself had slowed. The spectral soldier raised a hand as if to beckon me closer, and without fully understanding why, I felt compelled to obey. My voice, rough with emotion and choked by years of pent-up remorse, broke the silence. "I'm sorry," I managed to say. "I'm so sorry for everything I couldn't do." In response, the silent vigil did not speak with words. Instead, a flood of images overwhelmed my mind. Visions of the fateful day when the soldier had vanished during a training exercise. His desperate calls for help drowned out by chaos, and the anguished silence that followed when he was lost forever. Yet I saw flashes of a rescue attempt that went awry, of confusion and panic, and the realization that I had been powerless to change the outcome. The weight of guilt that I had carried for years pressed down on me with renewed intensity, and I fell to my knees in the pouring rain. Tears mingled with the rain as I begged for forgiveness, not just for the soldier, but for myself. I cried out for the opportunity to make amends, to bring closure to a tragedy that had defined so much of my life. The silent vigil stood silently as if absorbing every ounce of my anguish. In that raw, cathartic moment, I felt something shift within me, a subtle easing of the relentless self-reproach that had haunted my every step. When the storm finally began to relent, the spectral figure slowly receded into the mist, leaving behind an eerie calm. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I noticed something glinting near the base of an old, crumbling memorial. I walked over and discovered a small, weathered dog tag, its surface etched with initials and a date that tied back to the unsolved case. Clutching it tightly, I knew that the encounter had not provided all the answers, but it had forced me to confront the burden of guilt that had festered within me for so long. The remainder of that day was spent in a blur of repair work and introspection. I managed to coax my RV back to life with makeshift fixes and a reluctant acceptance of its many faults. As I drove away from that secluded clearing and the site of the spectral encounter, the images of the silent vigil and the raw emotions of that stormy night remained etched in my mind. I carried the dog tag as a tangible reminder of the confrontation, a symbol of both the pain of the past and the tentative promise of redemption. In the days and weeks that followed, I found that the boundaries between my memories and the present had irrevocably blurred. Every time I listened to the RV's old radio, I could still hear those ghostly transmissions, faded voices and fragments of military chatter that spoke of loss and longing. My photographs, once simple records of nature's beauty, now contained shadowy figures in the background, as if the past itself had followed me into the present. I began documenting every detail of my journey, writing down the strange occurrences, the inexplicable markers, and the moments when the veil between life and death seemed thinner than ever before. I wasn't sure if the silent vigil was a genuine supernatural presence or simply a projection of my own tormented psyche, a manifestation of guilt and regret made real by the isolation of the forest. Perhaps the truth lay somewhere in between, a haunting blend of the external and the internal. Back in the relative safety of my daily routine, I still keep that weathered dog tag on my desk, a silent, constant reminder of that fateful night in the Angeles National Forest. Sometimes, when a gust of wind rattles the window or the old radio crackles unexpectedly, I pause, my heart skipping a beat, and remember the sorrowful eyes of the silent vigil. Though I have not fully unraveled the mysteries of that encounter, I have learned that confronting one's darkest memories is the only way to begin healing. I drive on now, both literally and metaphorically, carrying with me the weight of that experience as well as the faint hope that forgiveness of both the lost soldier and myself is possible. The forest continues to whisper its secrets in the wind, and I know that some echoes of the past will never truly be silenced. Yet, with every mile I travel, I strive to transform that lingering guilt into a quiet determination to honor those who were lost and to forge a future unburdened by the ghosts of yesterday. That is my story, a journey into the heart of darkness, where the boundaries between the living and the dead blur into a single haunting moment. The silent vigil, with its mournful gaze and unyielding presence, showed me that redemption is not found in forgetting our past, but in facing it head-on, accepting our failures, and allowing ourselves to heal. And though I may never fully escape the shadows that follow me, I now walk forward with a renewed resolve to seek the light beyond them. O3 Mini.